Some buildings have a lock on the door. These 12 have armed soldiers, radar-tracked airspace, and in a couple of cases, a standing order that trespassers won't get a warning shot. They span deserts, mountains, moats, and one very cold Arctic archipelago most people couldn't point to on a map. So today, we're counting down the 12 most guarded places on Earth, protected by the Army 24/7. Number 12, Porton Down, England. Tucked into the Wiltshire countryside, Porton Down has operated as Britain's chemical and biological defense laboratory since 1916. Originally built to study the exact kind of gas warfare that was tearing through the trenches of the First World War, using several thousand acres of restricted heathland as a buffer against curious eyes. Today it houses the Defense Science and Technology Laboratory, and its perimeter is patrolled by the Ministry of Defense Police, an armed force with full constabulary powers specifically because of what's stored inside, backed by fencing, CCTV, and restricted airspace overhead that civilian pilots are required to route around entirely. The facility earned grim, permanent notoriety in 1953 when a 20-year-old airman named Ronald Madison volunteered for what he was told was a common cold trial and was instead exposed to nerve agent sarin dripped onto a patch of fabric on his arm. He died within the hour, and it took a fresh inquest, held in 2004, more than 50 years later, to finally rule his death unlawful killing rather than misadventure. More recently, Porton Down became a household name again in 2018, when it was the laboratory that identified the exact strain of Novichok nerve agent used in the poisoning of former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in nearby Salisbury, a case that put the normally anonymous facility directly in the middle of an international diplomatic crisis. Its own scientists put it about as plainly as government scientists ever do. Identifying a specific batch of a chemical weapon down to its production lot is precisely the kind of work the site exists to do, and precisely why it stays fenced, armed, and off the map for casual visitors. The surrounding Porton Down ranges, a further stretch of restricted land used for open-air trials, remain closed to the public year-round, and unauthorized entry there is treated as seriously as trespassing on any active military firing range in the country. Number 11. Menwith Hill, England. On a stretch of Yorkshire moorland outside Harrogate sits one of the largest electronic monitoring stations on the planet, instantly recognizable by dozens of massive white golf ball-shaped radomes rising out of the sheep pasture around it, a genuinely surreal sight for drivers passing along the otherwise ordinary country road nearby. Officially RAF Menwith Hill, the base is operated almost entirely by American personnel from the National Security Agency, despite technically sitting on Royal Air Force land, and it's guarded around the clock by both British Ministry of Defense police and US military security teams working under a joint command structure. Opened in 1960 and formally handed over to the NSA's operational control in the mid-1960s. Menwith Hill grew over the Cold War into a central node of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, intercepting satellite communications across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, working in tandem with sister stations like Pine Gap on the other side of the world. Investigative journalist Duncan Campbell was among the first to publicly expose the scale of the base's surveillance capacity back in the 1980s. Work that helped trigger parliamentary debate over just how much spying was happening on British soil without British oversight. Debate that has resurfaced periodically ever since with each new leak or investigative report. Regular protests have gathered outside its fences for decades, including a long-running women's peace camp that maintained a presence near the base for years, but none of it has ever gotten anyone meaningfully closer to the roughly 30 radomes themselves, which remain guarded, floodlit, and functioning exactly as designed. Local residents in nearby villages have grown so used to the base's presence that its glowing white domes barely register as strange anymore, even to visitors who've never seen anything quite like them clustered together on an otherwise unremarkable stretch of English farmland. Number 10. Novaya Zemlya, Russia. This Arctic archipelago, stretching across roughly 90,000 square kilometers north of the Russian mainland, hosted the single most powerful nuclear device ever detonated by humans, the Tsar Bomba, a 50-megaton hydrogen bomb set off on October 30th, 1961. with a blast wave that reportedly circled the Earth 3 times and shattered windows hundreds of miles away in Norway and Finland. A shockwave powerful enough that the bomber crew that dropped it was given roughly a 50% chance of surviving their own delivery flight. Between 1955 and 1990, the Soviet Union conducted 224 nuclear tests here, and the northern test site remains an active Russian military zone today, closed entirely to civilians and patrolled by the country's northern fleet. Access requires specific permission from Russian military authorities, and even Russian citizens need special clearance simply to travel there, let alone approach the test ranges themselves, which sit hundreds of miles from the archipelago's small remaining settlement. The archipelago's tiny native Nenets population was relocated decades ago to make way for the program. Forced from a homeland their families had occupied for generations, and while Russia declared an official moratorium on nuclear testing in 1990, Novaya Zemlya has remained an active military installation ever since, occasionally resurfacing in the news whenever officials hint at the possibility of resumed testing. It's less a single guarded building than an entire guarded island chain, patrolled by a military that has spent 70 years treating public curiosity about the place as a security problem rather than a tourism opportunity. Even satellite mapping services show the northern test range only in low resolution, a quiet reminder that some of the most heavily restricted places on the planet aren't hidden behind a single fence at all, but behind an entire country's worth of official secrecy. Number 9. Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, Pyongyang, North Korea. Originally built in 1976 as Kim Il-sung's official residence and assembly hall, this sprawling complex was converted into a mausoleum after his death in 1994, and again after his son Kim Jong-il's death in 2011, and it now holds the title of the largest mausoleum dedicated to a single communist leader anywhere on Earth, with interior hallways stretching more than half a mile long and a total floor space exceeding 115,000 square feet, large enough that Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu reportedly used a visit to an earlier version of the building as direct inspiration for his own People's Palace back in Bucharest. It's guarded permanently by troops from North Korea's dedicated Guards Command, and the entire 500-meter square in front of the palace is ringed by a moat and a high concrete wall, giving the whole complex the physical footprint of a fortress rather than a memorial. Visitors, on the rare occasions foreigners are permitted inside at all, are only admitted Thursday and Sunday mornings, required to dress formally and march through multiple security checkpoints and an air blast chamber before reaching the embalmed bodies themselves, each displayed under glass with a military honor guard posted at all 4 corners of the sarcophagus. Photography is banned throughout. Personal belongings must be surrendered at the door, and visitors are required to bow at each side of the display in strict, choreographed formation, moved along on slow-rolling walkways so no one lingers too long in any one spot. Calling it a mausoleum out loud to a Korean guide, by the way, is considered outright disrespectful. Officially, in North Korea, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il aren't described as having died at all, and the palace itself is treated less like a tomb and more like the country's single most sacred living monument. The building's 2013 designation as a national treasure only formalized what had already been true in practice for decades. Nothing in North Korea receives a heavier security footprint, not even the country's actual seat of government. Number 8. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia. Headquarters of the entire United States Department of Defense, the Pentagon is, by floor area, one of the largest office buildings on the planet, housing roughly 26,000 military and civilian employees across 5 concentric rings connected by 17.5 miles of corridors, all somehow designed so efficiently that even first-time visitors are usually told they can walk between any 2 points in the building in under 7 minutes, a claim the building's original 1940s architects apparently took as a genuine design mandate rather than a nice-to-have feature. It's protected by its own dedicated Pentagon Force Protection Agency, an armed federal law enforcement body created specifically to guard the building and its surrounding reservation around the clock, backed by additional military police and, when threat levels rise, visible anti-aircraft assets on the roof. The building's darkest chapter came on September 11, 2001, when hijacked American Airlines Flight 77 was flown directly into the western side of the building, killing 189 people and tearing through several of its outer rings before the structure's reinforced construction, part of a renovation already underway that morning that had added blast-resistant windows and steel reinforcement to that exact section, helped limit the damage from being even worse. That section, rebuilt and reopened within a year under the name the Phoenix Corridor, now includes an indoor memorial reserved specifically for Pentagon employees, alongside a larger outdoor memorial park open to the public along the building's western edge. Access to the building today runs through mandatory badge checks, vehicle barriers rated to stop a fully loaded truck at highway speed, and a no-fly restriction over the site that the Federal Aviation Administration treats as one of the most tightly enforced in the country. Even routine deliveries and visitor tours, which do exist for members of the public who book weeks in advance through their congressional representative, follow a fixed, pre-screened route that never strays anywhere near the building's operational command centers. Number 7. Buckingham Palace, London, England. The official London residence of the British monarch has been guarded by the same ceremonial unit, the King's Guard, since the reign of Queen Victoria, drawn from regiments of the Household Division, whose lineage traces back centuries, complete with the famous bearskin caps that are, contrary to popular belief, made from real Canadian black bear fur rather than any synthetic substitute, and which require a strict, time-consuming grooming ritual to keep looking presentable through London's unpredictable weather. But the bearskin hats and rigid marching routine that tourists photograph every morning are only the visible layer. Behind them sits a genuinely serious, largely plainclothes security operation coordinating armed Metropolitan Police officers, military personnel, and the Royalty and Specialist Protection Command. That layered system has, on at least one notorious occasion, spectacularly failed. In July 1982, an unemployed decorator named Michael Fagan scaled the palace's perimeter wall, climbed a drainpipe, and made his way into Queen Elizabeth II's own bedroom, waking her and holding a conversation for roughly 10 minutes before palace staff finally intervened, an intrusion that somehow went entirely unnoticed by the officer supposedly stationed outside her door. The incident triggered a total overhaul of royal security procedures that's still referenced in security briefings decades later, and it remains one of the most cited case studies in royal protection failures anywhere in the world. Today's protections go considerably further than a taller fence. Reinforced windows, hidden pressure sensors, and, since a series of drone incidents at other UK military and royal sites in recent years, active airspace monitoring specifically designed to catch exactly the kind of low-tech intrusion Fagan managed to pull off on foot more than 4 decades ago. Palace security today also coordinates closely with the wider Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Command, a partnership that barely existed in any formal sense back in 1982 and now runs continuously, whether or not the King himself happens to be in residence that week. Number 6. Pine Gap, Australia. Officially, the Joint Defense Facility, Pine Gap, this satellite surveillance station sits in a shallow desert valley about 11 miles southwest of Alice Springs, chosen specifically because its remote inland location made it nearly impossible for foreign spy ships to intercept its signals from open water, while also keeping it far from the electromagnetic interference that clutters more populated regions, and geologically stable enough to avoid the kind of ground vibration that could throw off its most sensitive receiving equipment. Jointly run by the United States and Australia since a 1966 agreement, the site now bristles with 45 satellite radomes, and the Australian Federal Police handle its physical perimeter security around the clock, backed by access roads lined with blunt, unmistakable warning signs reading, "No through road, go back." Pine Gap's role has expanded dramatically since the Cold War, now serving as a critical downlink station for satellites that guide American drone strikes and missile defense targeting across roughly a third of the globe, relaying data in real time to Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado. Locals have taken to calling it Australia's Area 51, and access is governed so tightly that even Australian Federal Parliamentary Committee members have historically been refused entry. As Australian security researcher Richard Tanter put it after tallying the site's growing antenna count over the years, describing the government's habit of downplaying the base's scale, "The government likes to say one base. It's not. It's 3 in 1. Decades of protests from traditional Aboriginal landowners of the site, the Arrernte people, continue outside the perimeter fence to this day, so far without any change to who actually controls what's inside it. A 3-generation family of Kuyunba traditional owners joined one such demonstration outside the base in July of 2026, marking 60 years since the land was first occupied for the facility without their consent, a milestone that drew renewed attention to a dispute that predates the base's very first radome. Number 5. Diego Garcia, British Indian Ocean Territory. Roughly 1,000 miles from the nearest mainland, this coral atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean hosts one of the most strategically important and most restricted military installations on Earth. Jointly operated by the United States and United Kingdom since the early 1970s, after Britain forcibly relocated the island's entire Chagassian population, roughly 1,200 people who'd lived there for generations, to make way for the base, Diego Garcia today has no permanent civilian residence at all. Only around 2,500 to 4,000 military personnel and contractors, all requiring pre-approved Department of Defense clearance simply to land. There are no commercial flights, no tourist visas, and maritime access is heavily restricted to the point that even British judicial officials have been denied entry in recent years over stated security concerns, a dispute that made international headlines when the US blocked a British court hearing from taking place on what is technically British sovereign territory. The base functions as a permanent staging ground for American long-range bombers and naval operations stretching from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, and it came under direct attack in 2026 when Iran launched ballistic missiles at the facility during the opening weeks of a broader US-Israel conflict with Tehran. A 2025 treaty laying out an eventual transfer of sovereignty to Mauritius has yet to change anything about who actually controls access on the ground, which, for the foreseeable future, remains exactly nobody without a military reason to be there. Even the roughly 1,200 Chagassians displaced when the base was first built have never been permitted to return, despite decades of legal challenges and a 2019 International Court of Justice advisory opinion, finding the original detachment of the islands from Mauritius unlawful, a ruling the United States and United Kingdom have continued to treat as non-binding. Number 4. Panmunjom Joint Security Area, Korean DMZ. Along the 38th parallel, inside the otherwise empty 4-kilometer buffer separating North and South Korea, sits the one stretch of the entire demilitarized zone, where armed soldiers from both sides stand within feet of each other, some days closer than an arm's length across a painted concrete line running straight through the middle of a conference room the two sides still occasionally use for negotiations. Established after the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed here on July 27, 1953, the Joint Security Area is patrolled jointly and under strict rules by the North Korean military on one side and the US-led United Nations Command on the other, with a 1953 agreement capping each side at no more than 35 troops present at any given time, each permitted only a single pistol or non-automatic rifle. Tensions haven't stayed purely symbolic. On August 18, 1976, North Korean soldiers used axes to kill 2 American officers overseeing a routine tree trimming operation near a UN observation post, an incident that pushed the US military alert level to its highest posture since the Korean War itself, before a tense, heavily armed tree-cutting mission, escorted by attack helicopters and an aircraft carrier task force positioned just offshore, finally resolved the standoff without further bloodshed. In 1984, a Soviet tour guide's sudden dash across the demarcation line sparked a 30-minute firefight that left 1 South Korean soldier and 3 North Korean soldiers dead. Guided tours still run through the JSA today, but visitors follow strict rules: no pointing, no staring, no gesturing toward North Korean soldiers, under the direct supervision of the same rotating security battalion that's guarded this single village since the ceasefire. Tour groups must also carry valid passports, meet a minimum age requirement of 10 years old, and agree in advance to a dress code that bars anything resembling military clothing. A rule specifically meant to avoid any visual confusion at a border where soldiers on both sides are watching every visitor's every move. Number 3. Vatican City. The world's smallest sovereign state is also guarded by one of its oldest continuously operating military units. The Pontifical Swiss Guard has protected the Pope since Pope Julius II founded the force on January 22, 1506, drawing on Switzerland's centuries-old reputation for producing some of Europe's most disciplined and battle-tested mercenaries. When the first contingent of 150 soldiers, led by Captain Caspar von Silenen, arrived in Rome and were blessed by the Pope himself from the Benediction Loggia, its defining moment came during the sack of Rome on May 6, 1527, when 147 of 189 guardsmen died defending Pope Clement VII, buying him enough time to escape through a secret elevated passage, the roughly 800-meter Passetto di Borgo, to the nearby fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo, a sacrifice new recruits still swear their oath in honor of every single year on that exact anniversary date. Today's roughly 135-strong force, expanded from just 110 members a decade earlier, is far more than a colorful, halberd-carrying photo opportunity for tourists. Recruits must be Catholic, unmarried, Swiss, between 19 and 30, at least 5 feet 8, and must have already completed basic training with the Swiss Army before they're even eligible to apply. And the Guard's modern duties extend into close protection, counter-surveillance, and coordinated security work alongside the Vatican's Gendarmerie Corps. The famous Renaissance striped uniform, contrary to popular myth, wasn't designed by Michelangelo at all. It was created in the early 20th century by a Swiss commander named Jules Ripond, drawing on Medici family colors for the palette. A design so distinctive, it's become one of the most recognizable military uniforms anywhere in the world, despite guarding a country smaller than most golf courses. Beyond the ceremonial halberds, guards today also train in firearms and hand-to-hand combat. And during a papal conclave, the entire force shifts into an even higher security posture, sealing off access points around the Sistine Chapel until a new pope has been chosen and the world's cardinals are safely dispersed again. Number 2. Zhongnanhai, Beijing, China. Sitting directly beside the Forbidden City behind centuries-old red walls, Zhongnanhai functions as China's version of the White House and the Kremlin rolled into one. The working headquarters and residence of the Chinese Communist Party's top leadership, including President Xi Jinping himself. Guarded by an elite military unit responsible for the personal safety of the country's most senior officials, the compound is closed to the public entirely, its footprint censored on Chinese digital mapping platforms so thoroughly that even satellite imagery services blur or obscure its layout. And the wall surrounding it is topped with countless CCTV cameras periscoping above the brickwork. Only a small handful of foreign leaders have ever been allowed past its walls, which made headlines again in May of 2026, when President Trump spent his final morning in Beijing walking Zhongnanhai's private gardens alongside Xi, admiring roses and photographing centuries-old trees, including one Xi noted was roughly 490 years old, before the two sat down for tea and lunch together. Author and former Zhongnanhai chronicler Daniel Aldrich has noted that even senior party officials who lived inside the compound historically found themselves under near-constant internal surveillance, quoting Chairman Mao's own physician, who once observed that residents there were always under surveillance, and that during the Cultural Revolution, even the simple act of lighting a fire inside the walls could draw the wrath of the compound's own security detail. It's proof that even at the absolute center of Chinese political power, being on the inside has never meant being unwatched. The complex's dual identity as both government nerve center and gated residential enclave has persisted for decades. A courtyard house near its edge was Deng Xiaoping's home from 1977 onward, and more recent leaders are widely believed, though never officially confirmed, to maintain additional private residences in a separate, similarly guarded compound on the western outskirts of the city, sometimes nicknamed the back garden of Chinese politics by those who study the country's opaque leadership structure from the outside. Number 1. The Kremlin, Moscow, Russia. And here's the one that gave an entire country's government its nickname. The Moscow Kremlin has functioned as the political heart of Russia in one form or another since the 14th century, and today it's guarded by the Federal Protective Service, a shadowy federal agency whose full staffing numbers remain officially classified, estimated by outside analysts at somewhere around 50,000 personnel across all of its responsibilities, alongside its most visible unit, the Kremlin Regiment, which has stood ceremonial and functional watch over the complex since 1936. Security here operates on multiple layers simultaneously. Uniformed honor guards conducting the changing of the guard ceremony tourists photograph, plainclothes protective officers embedded throughout the grounds, and rooftop snipers who take up visible positions along the Kremlin walls every time Red Square hosts a major public event, like the annual Victory Day military parade each May 9th. The Federal Protective Service's responsibilities go well beyond the physical building, too. It also maintains Russia's nuclear command communications infrastructure, including the briefcase-based system known as Chaget, that could theoretically be used to authorize a nuclear strike, meaning the same organization standing guard over centuries-old cathedrals and museums is simultaneously responsible for keeping the country's nuclear command chain operational and secure. It's a strange, layered combination of ceremonial pageantry and genuinely existential responsibility, all wrapped around roughly 90 acres of red brick walls in the center of Moscow. The Kremlin Regiment itself traces an unbroken institutional history back to 1936, surviving the collapse of the Soviet Union with its ceremonial functions largely intact, even as the political system around it was completely rebuilt. A continuity few other military units anywhere in the world guarding any seat of power can genuinely claim. Standing at the base of those red walls today, watching the changing of the guard march past with the same precision it's carried for nearly 90 years, it's easy to forget that the same complex has survived czars, revolutions, world wars, and the total collapse of the empire it once ruled, outlasting every single government that has ever tried to replace it. So there they are, 12 places where guarded doesn't mean a rent-a-cop and a key card. It means standing armies, rooftop snipers, restricted airspace, and in a couple of cases, rules written specifically after someone already tried to get in and paid for it. Some of these places protect world leaders, safeguarded by units whose entire institutional purpose is making sure one specific person survives the day. Some protect secrets nobody outside a small circle of officials is ever meant to see, radomes and cryptography rooms guarded as fiercely as any physical treasure. And a couple of them protect something considerably stranger: bodies, borders, and bomb craters that a government has decided the rest of us simply don't get to visit, regardless of how much curiosity that decision generates decades later. What ties all 12 together? Whether it's a 500-year-old oath in the Vatican or a satellite dish in the Australian outback, is the same basic calculation every single one of these governments has made. Some information, some people, and some places are worth more soldiers than almost anything else a country owns. Notice, too, how few of these sites rely on a single layer of protection. Nearly everyone stacks physical fencing, armed patrols, restricted airspace, and legal deterrence on top of each other because the governments running them have clearly decided that redundancy, not just intimidation, is what actually keeps a place secure for decades at a stretch. Either way, if you're thinking about testing any of these fences yourself, the soldiers standing behind them have made it extremely clear they're not there for decoration. If this rundown kept you hooked, hit like, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and let us know in the comments which of these 12 guarded places surprised you the most.